A simple woman, humiliated at the bank. Then her husband steps in and stuns. Everyone. Margaret Miller was never the type to seek attention. A quiet soul, she lived her days in Springfield, tending her garden, caring for her neighbors' pets when they were away, and working extra hours at the local diner. No one ever suspected she had a powerful ally, her own husband. On a mundane Tuesday morning, Margaret walked into the Springfield branch of Chase Bank, hoping to resolve a simple issue. Little did she know that errand would snowball into a public humiliation orchestrated by dismissive bank staff. But sometimes, fate has a way of turning the tables. And this time, it would stun everyone involved. Margaret Miller rose early that Tuesday, watching from her kitchen window as the sky turned pale pink in the dawn. Living on the outskirts of Springfield, she enjoyed life's simple pleasures, the chirping of birds outside her modest home, the smell of bread baking in the small oven, the warm good morning purrs from her elderly cat Whiskers. A short, unassuming woman in her mid-40s, Margaret had long grown accustomed to people overlooking her. Even her old high school peers who remembered her rarely gave her a second glance. She dressed plainly in a faded floral print blouse and a knee-length skirt, her only makeup a dab of lip balm to combat dryness. That morning, Margaret had something crucial to do. The previous night, she discovered a puzzling discrepancy on her bank statement. A sum of $500 had mysteriously disappeared from her account. She was no finance wizard, but she'd meticulously kept track of every deposit and withdrawal using her check register, a habit instilled by her late father who always preached the importance of balancing one's accounts. Feeling uneasy, she decided to visit her bank, the Springfield branch of Chase, and sort things out face to face. The branch lobby was cavernous and bustling with people. A huge poster showcasing a smiling couple promoting a new mortgage plan hung on the far wall. Margaret waited in line for nearly half an hour. She clutched her little notepad and bank statements in a small leather folder prepared to explain the discrepancy. When it was her turn, she approached a teller named Denise, a smartly dressed woman with pristine nails and a frigid smile. Denise, glancing at Margaret's modest outfit, greeted her with a perfunctory nod. "Good morning," Margaret said, softly fighting her nervousness. "I was hoping you could help me with a transaction discrepancy." Denise raised an eyebrow, scanning Margaret's documents. "What seems to be the issue, ma'am?" Margaret explained the situation, laying out her records and statements point by point. She was as detailed as she could be, quoting dates and amounts. By the end of her careful summary, she offered a hopeful, tentative smile. She expected some measure of empathy, or at the very least a professional courtesy. Instead, Denise's lips turned into a tight line, betraying impatience. "That's interesting," Denise said curtly, after typing furiously into the computer. "Are you sure you didn't just forget withdrawing that money?" Margaret's cheeks flushed. "I'm positive," she replied. "I keep track of every withdrawal, every debit card purchase. I can show you my notes." Denise shrugged, glancing at the clock like there were more important people to attend to. "Let's see if a manager can look into it." But sometimes these things happen because customers don't keep accurate records. Margaret swallowed her frustration, determined to keep her composure. "I'm certain my records are accurate," she said firmly. Minutes later, Denise called over a junior manager named Jerome. He was a lean man in a crisp suit, not yet 30, carrying an air of authority. Standing behind the teller station, Jerome briefly looked over Margaret's documents. Then, with a sigh, he asked, "Ma'am, can you verify your account number? And are you sure no one else has access to your debit card?" She recited her account number and clarified that no one else had access. Not even her husband, Alan, withdrew money without her knowledge. Still, Jerome frowned. "There's no sign of a bank error from what I see on the computer," he replied, crossing his arms. "In many cases, it's a misunderstanding. $500 is a lot, but customers often forget authorized payments or checks." Margaret felt a surge of anger at the implication she was incompetent. "I'm careful with my money," she said. "Could you please investigate further? It might be a technical error or an unauthorized transaction." Jerome mustered a clipped nod. "We can open a dispute, but you must fill out some forms. In the meantime, you can wait over there. It might take a while." Margaret stepped aside to a row of chairs lining the wall, perched anxiously among other customers. She tried to still her racing heart, mentally rehearsing how to present her case so that the bank would take her seriously. She didn't want confrontation, just a resolution. Time stretched. 1 hour passed. 2. She watched people come and go, some leaving with contented smiles, others scowling in frustration. Margaret's stomach rumbled. She hadn't thought to bring a snack or even a water bottle. Eventually, Jerome re-emerged, waving her over to the desk next to the teller stations. This time, the branch manager, Mrs. Hathaway, loomed behind him. Mrs. Hathaway was an imposing figure in a tailored grey suit, a no-nonsense expression etched on her face. Her presence alone forced staff to stand a little straighter. Margaret politely rose, stepping forward with her folder clutched tight. "We looked into your claim," Mrs. Hathaway began, "but there isn't anything we can do at this point. The system shows that the money was withdrawn at an ATM. We have your signature on file, so any further dispute would have to be escalated. However, these escalations rarely work when the transaction is properly logged." Margaret swallowed her throat dry. "Ma'am, I never made that withdrawal. Can you check the ATM footage or the location?" "I can," Mrs. Hathaway replied, "but it's a lengthy process, and typically these cameras store footage for only a few weeks. Even then, ATM footage doesn't always help if the person was wearing a hat or something that obscures their identity." Margaret took a breath, feeling tears of frustration threaten to spill. I need that money. It's important. My husband and I are working hard to save up for some house repairs." Denise, who had been hovering, snorted softly. "Well, maybe you should make sure you're not overspending if money is that important." That condescending remark pricked Margaret's composure. She stared at Denise, then looked to Mrs. Hathaway. "Is this how you treat your customers, by implying they're irresponsible?" Mrs. Hathaway arched an eyebrow. "We are simply stating that we cannot find an error. In situations like this, it's best for you to track your spending more carefully, or consider if someone else made the withdrawal." Before Margaret could protest further, she noticed a few other employees and customers glancing her way. The open layout of the bank made the exchange far from private. She felt a wave of heat wash over her cheeks, the sting of humiliation. Struggling to keep her voice level, she asked quietly, "What if I escalate this beyond the branch?" Mrs. Hathaway offered a frosty smile. "You can contact our customer service hotline or write an email to the corporate office. But honestly, if the system says you withdrew the money, you'll need substantial proof to claim fraud or bank error." Margaret's heart sank. She felt cornered. "So that's it? You're not even willing to look deeper into the logs or see if there's an internal mistake?" Mrs. Hathaway drew herself up. "I've done what I can do with the resources we have here. If you'd like to take further action, you are, of course, free to do so. However, this discussion is taking up time that could be used to help other customers." In her peripheral vision, Margaret saw a pair of customers behind her, whispering, probably judging her predicament. She saw a teller at the far end of the counter smirk. The branch seemed to close in on her, a wave of shame, anger, and helplessness swirling in her chest. She mustered a shaky breath, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "All right," she whispered. "Then let me have the forms to escalate this." Jerome slid a small stack of papers across the desk. The page at the top read, "Transaction Dispute Form." "Fill these out. Return them to me," he said, not even looking her in the eyes. Margaret took them and found a seat again, the same stiff chair that had been her perch for the last couple of hours. Her hands trembled as she began writing. By now, the humiliating exchange had attracted enough attention that she felt the weight of strangers' eyes on her. A few offered sympathetic glances, but none dared interrupt. She phoned her husband, Alan Miller, as soon as she stepped outside for a quick breath of fresh air. The bank lobby had grown stuffy, suffocating. Alan picked up on the first ring. He was at work, but from his tone she could hear he was immediately concerned. "What's going on, sweetheart? You sound upset." Margaret swallowed back tears and explained everything. The missing $500, the bank's dismissal, the humiliating remarks, the manager's coldness. Alan listened patiently. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. Look, let me wrap things up here. I can meet you at the bank in an hour. I'll handle it." She almost hesitated. Alan was a mild-mannered man, rarely one to stir trouble. But she knew he had connections in unexpected places. Ever since college, he'd built an impressive network of acquaintances in finance and law, even though he never showed off about it. Margaret exhaled a shaky sigh. "All right, but don't feel like you have to come if you're too busy." "Absolutely not," he replied. "I'll be there." She returned inside, found a quiet corner, and tried to remain calm. Margaret filled out the dispute forms to the best of her ability. When she handed them back to Jerome, he gave a clipped nod. "We'll submit these. You might hear back in a few weeks. Meanwhile, you can check with the corporate office if you think it's urgent." Margaret wanted to protest that it was urgent, but something in his dismissive tone stifled her. Reluctantly, she turned away, a mixture of anger and sorrow swirling in her chest. As she waited by the row of chairs near the entrance, the minutes felt interminable. She pictured the mound of bills on her kitchen table at home. $500 might not be a fortune, but it was enough to disrupt their budget significantly. She and Alan worked hard. She picked up waitressing shifts at the local diner, while he put in long hours as an operations manager at a shipping company. Every penny was accounted for. When the door finally swung open, Margaret's heart gave a leap of relief. Alan stepped in wearing his usual work attire, pressed slacks, a light blue button-down, and a brown leather jacket. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, with dark hair just beginning to grey at the temples. The calm determination in his eyes steadied Margaret. She got up to greet him. He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked softly. She nodded, though tears glistened at the corners of her eyes. "I'm fine, now that you're here." She motioned around the bank. "But they, especially the manager, treated me like I was lying or too dumb to keep track of my money." Alan's jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." He guided her toward the teller area. By now, Jerome had stepped away, but Denise spotted them approaching and rolled her eyes. "Can I help you, sir?" Alan offered a tight smile. "Yes, you can. I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge. We need to resolve my wife's issue immediately." Denise's mouth twisted slightly, but she called Mrs. Hathaway over. The branch manager arrived, her posture stiff. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted. "Is this about the same issue?" "It is," Alan replied, his tone polite yet unwavering. I'd like more information on what you've done to investigate the missing $500. Mrs. Hathaway rehashed the same spiel, her voice unwavering. There's no indication of an error on the bank's side, Mr. Miller. The transaction shows as a legitimate ATM withdrawal. Unless your wife has proof it wasn't her, our hands are tied. Alan nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. May I ask if you've checked internal logs to see if there was any known glitch or double posting error? She pursed her lips. Our system is updated regularly. We have no record of a glitch. All right, Alan said calmly. I'd also like to review the relevant financial regulations regarding disputed transactions. As I understand, under Regulation E, the bank is obligated to investigate if a customer claims an unauthorized withdrawal. Mrs. Hathaway's composure flickered. She wasn't used to customers citing financial regulations. Yes, we follow Regulation E, she replied defensively. But we need substantial proof to proceed with a formal claim. Our initial inquiry found no reason to assume it was unauthorized. Alan leaned forward. Substantial proof like ATM camera footage correct, or matching PIN usage logs, timestamps, ATM location data. All these are typically part of a thorough investigation. Denise snorted again, but a warning look from Alan caused her to bite her tongue. Mrs. Hathaway nodded stiffly. Yes, that data is on file. However, we typically only retrieve it if the dispute passes initial checks. Frankly, the process is expensive and time-consuming. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude at her husband's calm, methodical approach. Where she felt powerless, Alan exuded confidence. He tapped his chin. So you're telling me you don't intend to retrieve it unless you deem it worth investigating? That's our process, Mrs. Hathaway replied coolly. And from the looks of it, your wife's transaction was legitimate. Alan let out a quiet laugh. Interesting. Because I happen to know someone in Chase Bank's regional office, George Norton. He's a long-time acquaintance. He'd be quite fascinated to learn that the Springfield branch manager doesn't think it's worth thoroughly investigating a missing $500, especially if that includes pulling ATM footage to confirm whether or not the customer was indeed the one withdrawing. Margaret blinked. She remembered hearing Alan mention George Norton in passing. They had attended a leadership conference together some years back. Denise and Mrs. Hathaway exchanged glances. The mention of a name from the regional office seemed to rattle them. Suddenly there was a shift in their demeanor. Caution slipped into Mrs. Hathaway's stance. I am not saying we won't investigate further, she said, forcing a thin smile. But we have protocols. If you'd like, I can expedite the dispute. It will require a formal request from you. Alan nodded once. I'd very much appreciate that. And while you're at it, please note that should your internal process fail to recover those funds or fail to confirm the transaction's legitimacy, I'll be happy to speak with George Norton directly, just to ensure everything is handled properly. The manager cleared her throat. Certainly. I'll proceed immediately. She motioned for Denise to prepare the necessary paperwork on her computer. Meanwhile, Alan and Margaret took a seat by the manager's desk. Margaret could see the tension in the air. There was no longer the dismissive attitude or condescension from the staff. Now they realized the couple might have some measure of influence. As they waited, Alan leaned over to Margaret, whispered, "This might take a bit. Stay calm, okay?" She squeezed his hand. "Thank you," she whispered back, eyes shimmering with relief. After a short while, Mrs. Hathaway returned with a more cordial tone. "We'll pull the ATM footage and logs from the day and time in question. It may take 24 to 48 hours to receive them from our security vendor. but I'll place it as a priority." Margaret nodded, a tightness in her chest slowly easing. "Thank you." Alan offered another thin smile. "We appreciate your cooperation." Mrs. Hathaway cleared her throat again. "In the meantime, we'll grant a provisional credit. If it's found later that the withdrawal was indeed authorized, we'll reverse that credit." Margaret's eyes widened. "A provisional credit," Alan explained gently for her benefit. "It's a temporary credit while they investigate. If they can't prove it was authorized, they'll make the credit permanent." "That's correct," Mrs. Hathaway said with a forced politeness. "Is that acceptable?" "Mr. and Mrs. Miller." Margaret nodded eagerly. "That's more than acceptable." Relief washed over her. Even if it was temporary, at least she wouldn't have to scramble to pay the month's bills. Once everything was in motion, Alan rose, extending a hand to Mrs. Hathaway. "Thank you for your assistance." She accepted the handshake, though her expression was more subdued than when they'd first started. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Denise, standing off to the side, busied herself with organizing papers, though Margaret could see her sideways glances, tinged with annoyance, or perhaps fear. Margaret and Alan left the bank together. Outside, the crisp, late-morning air brushed over them. Margaret finally released a shaky breath, letting tears spill down her cheeks. Alan pulled her into a comforting hug. "Hey, it's okay," he murmured into her hair. "We'll figure this out." She sniffled, then let out a soft laugh. "I'm so glad you came. If you hadn't, they would have dismissed me completely." Alan's brow furrowed. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. Sometimes these institutions forget that customers are people. They only respond when they sense potential repercussions." Margaret nodded. "I just hope it all works out." Alan gave her a reassuring squeeze. "It will. And if not, we'll push further." They parted ways, Margaret back to her tasks in town, Alan returning to his job. That afternoon, Margaret couldn't stop replaying the humiliating scene in her mind, how the staff had sneered, how the manager had practically brushed her off. Her usual calm and gentle spirit wrestled with anger and frustration. Yet she was heartened by the change once Alan mentioned his connection and threatened to escalate the matter to someone higher up. But the real twist would come later, because sometimes, just because a matter is handled doesn't mean those who inflicted harm are off the hook. Fate had a way of turning the tables in a more dramatic fashion than Margaret ever anticipated. 3 days later, Margaret received a phone call from the bank. It was Jerome, the junior manager. He sounded more polite this time, explaining that they had retrieved the ATM footage. Indeed, the footage showed a figure wearing a dark cap, withdrawing money from an ATM in a different part of the city, far from where Margaret had ever been. The person's face was partially obscured, but it clearly wasn't Margaret, nor did it resemble Alan. "We suspect identity theft or a stolen card," Jerome told her. "We're currently coordinating with the police and our internal fraud department. Rest assured, the provisional credit will become permanent once the investigation is complete." Margaret thanked him, relief and vindication flooding her. She was about to end the call when Jerome hesitated. "There's another matter, Mrs. Miller." "Yes?" she asked. There was a short pause. "It seems the withdrawal posted incorrectly under your account due to an internal error. Something to do with how your account number was keyed in by a teller for a different transaction. The individual who withdrew the money was withdrawing from their own account. The system associated it with your account number by mistake, which is why it looked like your transaction." Margaret's jaw dropped. "So it was an internal mistake?" "After all that you're telling me, The bank messed up. Jerome let out a subdued sigh. We're investigating exactly how it happened. I can't say more. But we apologize for any inconvenience or misunderstanding. We'll credit you the full amount. An apology would have been nice earlier, she said, a slight edge to her usually gentle tone. She ended the call soon after, her emotions swirling. On one hand, she was relieved. On the other, she felt anger and hurt. The branch had demeaned her, implied she was either lying or negligent, when all along it had been a glitch in their system. Alan was livid when he heard the news. They basically said you were incompetent, and it turns out it was their incompetence, he fumed. I'm going to have a word with George. Margaret placed a hand on his arm. Don't do anything that might cause trouble for you, she said, though her eyes sparked with a sense of justice. Margie, they humiliated you. That has consequences. She squeezed his hand. Okay. But let's see what happens. They credited the account. We got our money back. Alan nodded, though Margaret could see the wheels turning in his mind. A week passed uneventfully. Margaret noticed that the Springfield branch manager, Mrs. Hathaway, had started leaving voicemails on her phone, politely asking Margaret to come back in, so they could personally apologize and discuss a few final paperwork details. Margaret wasn't keen on returning to that bank, but out of courtesy, she scheduled an appointment the following Friday. When she arrived, the atmosphere was markedly different. The once haughty faces looked nervous. The staff offered overly polite greetings. Mrs. Hathaway emerged from her office wearing a strained smile. Jerome hovered nearby, trying to project professionalism, but clearly on edge. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Hathaway greeted. We want to personally apologize for the frustration you experienced. We realized it was an internal coding error that caused the funds to appear withdrawn from your account. We have taken measures to ensure it does not happen again. Margaret sat in the same seat where she'd been humiliated days ago. She folded her hands in her lap, calm but resolute. I appreciate the apology, though it's late. Mrs. Hathaway lowered her gaze slightly. We acknowledge that. And, we also want to let you know we value you as a customer. We'd like to offer you a small token of goodwill, a year of free checking, no monthly service fees, plus a nominal gift card to express our regret. Margaret glanced at the $100 Visa gift card they slid across the desk. In times past, a gesture like this might have swayed her into gratitude. But she felt no such inclination now. Instead, she quietly said, I'll accept your apology, but I hope your staff learns to treat customers with respect next time. A flicker of relief crossed Mrs. Hathaway's face. Of course, we're revising our training to ensure that. Margaret noticed Denise standing off to the side, hands clasped. Perhaps she'd been told to hold her tongue. Margaret's eyes met hers, and for a moment Denise averted her gaze, cheeks reddening with embarrassment or shame. With that, Margaret concluded her meeting and left. She told Alan about it that evening. He nodded. At least they tried to make amends. Then he added with a hint of satisfaction, I heard from George Norton. He told me the regional office got wind of the fiasco. Seems the bank made a bigger mistake than they let on. Margaret looked up from where she was slicing vegetables for dinner. What do you mean? Alan shrugged. Turns out the coding error that affected your account also affected a few other customers. Some of them complained too. The regional office launched an investigation. They found a series of sloppy mistakes. Word is they might be cleaning house at the Springfield branch. Margaret paused in her chopping. You don't think Mrs. Hathaway or Jerome will lose their jobs, do you? Alan sighed. I can't say. It's possible they'll get demoted or reassigned. They've already singled out certain staff for poor customer service, apparently. George said there were multiple complaints about the manager's attitude. Margaret recalled the look on Mrs. Hathaway's face that afternoon. Suddenly, she understood the subtext. The bank was trying to placate her in hopes she wouldn't escalate the situation. "I only wanted my money back," she murmured. "I never wanted people to lose their jobs." Alan nodded sympathetically. "I know. But sometimes how people treat customers comes back to them." Sure enough, over the next few weeks, the local news and rumor mill buzzed with word that there were staff shake-ups at the Springfield branch. Denise quietly vanished from the teller line. Some said she was transferred. Others said she was let go. Jerome, it was rumored, took a demotion to a smaller branch in a neighboring town. Mrs. Hathaway soon retired early. Whether it was forced or voluntary, no one knew for sure. Margaret felt a pang of pity, but also a sense of justice. She remembered every snide remark, every dismissive gesture. She remembered the tears of frustration and helplessness she'd shed. She might not have actively sought revenge, but it seemed the universe had balanced the scales. While Margaret and Alan were content to move on from the ordeal, fate had one last twist in store. About a month after everything settled, Margaret was at the local grocery store. She pushed a small cart of produce and essentials, stopping at the baked goods aisle. She paused in front of the bread selection, debating wheat or sourdough. To her surprise, she spotted Denise, the former teller, among the aisles. Denise was out of uniform, wearing a rumpled sweatshirt and jeans. She seemed a far cry from the immaculate, perfectly polished teller Margaret remembered. She was scanning the shelves, looking for something, her expression distracted. Margaret hesitated, uncertain whether to greet her. She had no ill will by nature, but the memory of Denise's smug smirk was still fresh. Then, as if sensing a gaze, Denise turned and locked eyes with her. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. She quickly glanced away like she hoped Margaret hadn't noticed her, but there was no avoiding it. They stood only a few feet apart. In an awkward gesture, Margaret cleared her throat. "Denise." "Hi." Denise straightened the tension obvious in her face. "Oh. Hi, Mrs. Miller." For a moment, both women stood there in strained silence, surrounded by rows of bread. Then Denise spoke, her voice quieter than Margaret ever remembered. I'm sorry for how I treated you that day." Margaret studied her. The arrogance was gone. What remained was a deflated humility. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate that." Denise stared at the bread loaves, fumbling with her words. "I lost my job shortly after that mess," she admitted. "They said it was for not following best practices with customers, among other things." Margaret felt an uncomfortable pang. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Don't be." Denise sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It was my own doing, I guess. I should have handled things differently. My attitude cost me." Margaret tried to muster something comforting. She wasn't sure what to say. "I hope you're finding something better," she managed. Denise gave a half-hearted shrug. "Looking for it. In the meantime, I'm working part-time at a friend's shop, barely making rent." She let out a hollow laugh, then met Margaret's eyes. "You know, I used to see customers come in and think I was above them. And now, well, I guess life teaches you lessons." A silence stretched. Margaret felt sympathy rising. The memory of her own humiliation in that bank line flashed across her mind. She could have gloated or offered a platitude. Instead, she gently nodded, her voice soft. "We all have to learn lessons at some point. I hope things get better for you, Denise." Denise's eyes brimmed with unexpected tears, and she quickly turned away, mumbling, "Thank you," before hurrying off. Margaret stood there for a moment, feeling a swirl of emotions. She had never wished ill on anyone. But life had a way of dishing out karma, it seemed. In the months that followed, Margaret and Alan continued their modest life in Springfield. The bank fiasco turned into a story they occasionally recounted at family gatherings, a testament to how one should always stand up for themselves. Over time, the Springfield branch underwent a reorganization. New managers came, the interior was remodeled, and Margaret noticed a friendlier atmosphere whenever she had to stop by for routine transactions. Alan stayed in occasional contact with George Norton, who confirmed that the fiasco was indeed part of a larger spree of errors traced to staff negligence and improper training. Multiple customers had been affected, and the bank was scrambling to rebuild its reputation. Margaret maintained her account at Chase, partly out of convenience, but also because she believed in the possibility of redemption. Institutions could change just like people. For Margaret, the ordeal had taught her that one's worth wasn't determined by fancy clothes or flashy status. She was a simple woman, but not a doormat. She also saw firsthand how easily those in positions of minor power could abuse it until real accountability arrived. And sometimes that accountability came in the form of someone's husband, armed with a name and a willingness to fight. In quiet moments, Margaret reflected on the entire experience. She remembered the shame, the tears, and then the profound relief when Alan stood by her side unwavering. She realized that while she valued humility and kindness, there were times when assertiveness was necessary. People could only take advantage if she let them. And although she didn't relish the downfall of the branch manager or the teller, she recognized it as a natural consequence of their own hubris. Life rolled on. Margaret still woke early each day to feed Whiskers and tend her garden, made calls to her aging mother, and put in hours at the diner. Alan continued his work, occasionally traveling for business, always returning with a warm hug and funny stories. The couple saved what they could, inching closer to funding a full renovation of their old house. They faced challenges and joys alike, but one thing was certain: Margaret's confidence had grown. She knew better than ever that her voice mattered, and so a simple errand gone awry became a story of humiliation, vindication, and powerful lessons. The bank employees who underestimated a quiet, modest customer learned that appearances can be deceiving, and that underestimating the wrong person can cost you everything. In the end, Margaret Miller, the simple woman they scoffed at, walked away with a full heart and her dignity intact. And those who humiliated her, they faced the consequences of their actions delivered not by an angry fist or lawsuit, but by the steady hand of justice and a bit of well-deserved karma. Margaret's story reminds us never to judge a book by its cover. Her perseverance under adversity and the unwavering support of her husband show that quiet determination can shine brighter than any flashy display of power. In the face of dismissive attitudes, even the smallest voice can command respect when backed by the truth. And sometimes the hardest lessons come to those who think they can treat people poorly without consequence. If you've enjoyed this story of resilience and karmic justice, we invite you to become part of our community. Give this video a like if you found inspiration in Margaret's journey. Share it with friends who could use a reminder never to underestimate anyone, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that uplift, motivate, and stir the heart. Your support helps us continue bringing you tales that celebrate the triumph of decency and determination. Thank you for watching.